Hello and welcome back, you engineer, designer, architect, contractor, commissioning agent, or anybody else interested in the pitfalls and bear traps of Title 24, Part 6 acceptance testing under the 2013 code cycle. We are going to examine my least favorite type of lighting control, automatic demand response. First, we'll examine some of the undefined terms used in describing the power illumination reduction requirements for this type of control. Here's a definition I never wanted to see. This is a scheme by which lighting in an area is tuned down to save energy. Section 100.1 says tuning is the ability to set maximum light outputs at a lower level than full lighting power. By the way, full lighting power is not defined. We think we know what they're after here, but this is not a very good definition. It says institutional tuning is different than personal tuning, which is not defined, and it's done at an institutional level, also a term that is not defined. So even when you find a term defined in the code, it may not be defined very well. Here's an example from 110.9. 100.1 simply says that a part night outdoor lighting control is a time or occupancy-based lighting control device or system that is programmed to reduce or turn off the lighting power to an outdoor luminaire for a portion of the night. And that does seem fairly easy to understand until you look at section 110.9b. Bear in mind that they are saying the device has to have both of the first requirements and maybe the third requirement as well. So good luck figuring this one out. Here's a number of terms that I find either poorly defined or just plain not defined. Actually, these are not defined. Ornamental hardscape's one of my favorite because they have lighting requirements for ornamental hardscape outdoors. They have ornamental lighting is defined, hardscape is defined, but there's no such thing as ornamental hardscape in the definitions. So look at all these illuminance levels and power levels. Total installed lighting power, design full output, design illuminance, reference illuminance, highest light level foot candles, right? And they're still using an old term, time clock, which isn't even a word in the English language. Unfortunately, we have to figure out what these mean. Do not despair. Do not despair. Let's give it a shot. All my definitions are not official. These are not official definitions that I am giving you. So make up your own mind as to what these terms mean and own it. I don't have better advice. Total installed lighting power and total lighting power. These are used in the specification for mandatory demand response. Okay? We'll define total installed lighting power as the product. You take the number of luminaires, you take the manufacturer's spec sheet for their maximum draw, you multiply for the number of them in an area, and would that be total installed lighting power? If that's total installed lighting power, then section 130.1e doesn't really make a lot of sense, and that is your demand response requirement. Design full output, you're going to find this on the acceptance testing form. This one makes more sense for demand response. It's what you can get out of luminaires in an area when you turn all the area controls up for that area. Okay, the lighting is designed to go that high and no higher in that area. So we're going to assume that when they talk about full output for the demand response requirement, that's what they're talking about. Section 100.1 of the Bs has definitions concerning demand response. By the way, The acceptance test technician is supposed to verify that a control capable of receiving and responding to at least one standards-based messaging protocol exists on site. This is probably not exactly the correct word. Messaging is a noun, and it's the practice of sending and receiving written communications by computer or mobile phone for computers. For telecommunications in general, it is the practice of sending and receiving written communications by computer or mobile phone. We are going to assume that they mean some sort of a standard demand response signal. There's a couple of them in play right now. One of them is called ADR 2.0, I believe. Don't quote me on that. Read it and weep. And I believe corridors aren't habitable spaces either. During the 2013 code cycle, which is good until the end of 2016, this is going to change for the 2016 code cycle that comes into effect January 1st, 2017. But for right now, it says habitable spaces shall not be used to or only habitable spaces shall be used to comply with demand response. And corridors aren't habitable spaces, and stairwells aren't habitable spaces. So this definition is changing. Look, the lighting in a non-residential building is expected to come down from design full output during a demand response event, period. When you look at their definition here of demand responsive control, their requirement, their specification, it says the building's total lighting power can be lowered by a minimum of 15%. So this would lead you to believe that you could simply tune down the lighting in a building, turn it down by 15% below its fully installed lighting power, and you could claim you're in demand response all the time. You can't do that. You will fail acceptance testing. Okay, and we're going to take a quick look at this. Surprise! What the code is talking about is design full output, okay? Despite any interpretation of the verbiage in 130.1 Echo, lighting power is supposed to reduce from, quote, design full output, unquote, in a non-residential building during an automatic demand response event. Here is the full output test for this. Sliders up, dimmers up, whatever you can get out of the lighting in the area under test with the area controls, including multi-level controls. You take your power and or illumination reduction from that point during the full output test. By the way, surprise! Despite the fact that demand response events are most likely to occur in the middle of the afternoon in July and August, when automatic daylighting systems are likely to have their controlled lighting reduced to minimum level, this demand response requirement applies to those daylit areas as well. The required power reduction in the full output test is a building-wide requirement. Okay? It's all the areas under test, their reductions, and their areas fed into an area-weighted average formula. The area-weighted average formula is applied to all areas selected for testing by the acceptance test technician. Here is a full output test that passes for a building. This is an area-weighted average of all the areas under test. There is at least a 15% power reduction, but no more than 50%. Because if you have more than 50%, building-wide, you have more than 50% in one area, and that is not allowed. Here's one that fails. You didn't get your 15% overall. If a technician has selected areas for testing, he will test more areas to make sure that he is not failing you unnecessarily. Here is an individual area under test for a full output test where you have a failure because you are not allowed to reduce the lighting, illumination, or power, which are used interchangeably for demand response testing. You're not allowed to drop below half of the full design output or design full output, okay? Because the CEC says that's making the area too dark. By the way, there's another test. You may never have even heard of it. It's called the minimum output test. There's a second functional illumination or voltamp test, which many designers and/or commissioning persons do not know exist. In this test, the area lighting is set for the lowest, but not extinguished, level of illuminance using the area and multi-level controls, and then a demand response event is initiated. The area lighting should not reduce further, should not go any further down, or should not drop below 50% of the design full output illuminance. So let's take a look at this. Sliders down, dimmers down, using the area controls, we get to minimum design output. We initiate, and by the way, this is no area weighted average, no power reduction. This is a functionality test. So each individual area is tested separately for minimum output response. Here we're at minimum design output, and we initiate a demand response, and nothing happens. That's a pass. Here's one where we do the same thing, and we initiate a demand response, and the lights go out. That's a fail. Here's one where our minimum design output is still quite high. It's above 50% of the full design output, and when we initiate a demand response, it does not drop below the minimum design output, and it does not drop below 50% of full design output, so that's a pass. Here's one where it takes up a little slack. It drops below minimum design output, which is quite high in this case, but it doesn't drop below half of the full design output, so that's still a pass. Here's one where it drops below the minimum design output and half of the full design output, and that is a fail. But what about this? What about if the lighting increases from minimum output? Yeah, so you set everything to minimum design output and the lights go up when you initiate a demand response. If the illuminance in an area increases during a minimum output test, well, there's nothing in the building energy efficiency standards, reference appendices, or the acceptance testing certification form that says it can't. Seriously. Go take a look if you don't believe me. How did this happen? We don't know. When the CEC decided that demand response should be applied to daylit spaces, I'm afraid that trying to write this in one set of requirements became too confusing, and when they tried to reconcile this into that one set of requirements, it didn't work. So here is a bizarre situation where the minimum design output, sliders down, dimmers down, all that, is quite low, and when the demand response is initiated, the lighting goes up to like its full output test level. Well, there's nothing in the code or on the form, or on the acceptance testing form, that despite common sense says you can't do this. So there you have it. What about daylit spaces? Well, the code tries to take this into account by telling you to avoid them. So there's always a possibility that you can just do your test at night, or the technician can put his light meter as far away from sources of daylight as he can and check the reduction in the other general lighting in the space. So here's a brief summary of the demand response stuff. You've got a full output test and a minimum output test. And please join me for the next exciting section of pitfalls and bear traps of the 2013 code cycle, which involves daylighting systems. Thank you for your time and patience.